We are going to create, or I am going to demonstrate for you, creating this site here, or at least a version of this site. This here is Dave's Delectable Donuts. And then, so this was my redo of an existing website. And of course, if you remember from last video, which you probably just watched, we created a file folder for the Delectable Donut people. And so we have a production folder which has our logo, our lorem ipsum, our style guide, our wireframes, and all of our images. And then while you guys were gone, I took all my images and I optimized them in Photoshop and put them under the site folder, under that images folder, and so here they are here. Now what I did for all of them is I decided to format all of them as squares so they can be used in any format, vertical or horizontal. And of course I turned them into web-ready JPEGs set at a high web resolution, and they're each 1,000 pixels by 1,000 pixels. So they are big enough that they can look really good on a website, but small enough that they can load really fast. Remember to read that article that I linked in the last video about optimizing your images for the web. The only other thing is I did is I took this picture here, the original version of this, and I created sort of a banner graphic that I can use here because I know I wanted to use it in my header, which is just a sliver of that photo in its sort of out of focus blurred area. Now you can blur your own photos, of course, in Photoshop. That's easy. But what I like about this photo is that it has a really strong depth of field. So the donuts in the front are in focus and then they get more and more out of focus. So I just took a chunk from the back that was already out of focus photographically so I can use that in the header, and you can see it here in this version. All right, so I'm going to start a new document and we'll sort of go from there. So let's shut this down. And then this brings us back to the XD start page. I'm going to minimize a few things in the background here. And we'll go from there. We're going to need our photos, so I'll keep this open. I have Illustrator open in the background, which has my style guide with all my colors and my fonts and everything else. And then I even have access to just the logo directly, as well as my wireframes that we looked at. We're going to need all these. Now let's go into XD, and we are designing this at 1920 by 1080. So when you get into the start screen for Adobe XD, you'll notice that the Home tab has some preset sizes for mobile. These are various smartphones and tablets from both Google and Apple. Various standard web sizes, 1920 by 1080 is sort of the industry size. So we click on that and it brings us to our workspace with our first artboard, which is 1920 by 1080. So of course, just like everything you do in the world of Adobe, the first thing you want to do is save your document. Now you have two choices. If you simply go to Save As, it will open up your Creative Cloud online file system. So you can save it there and then access it through your Creative Cloud account. But if you want to save it locally, just put it on your computer. You have to specifically choose Save As Local Document, which is what I'm going to do just so I can have the file handy, right? So we're just going to do Dave Delectable Donuts, and I'm going to stick that on my desktop for now. Later on, I'll drag that into my site folder. Okay, so now that I've saved it somewhere, you guys should be familiar with the workspace by now because you've done those tutorials, but just to go over it very quickly, you have your toolbox on the left. You have your tab system at the top, design, prototype, and share, which are the 3 states of production that you can do in Adobe XD. We're going to start with design. That's where we always start. You have 3 palettes over here on the left. You have your assets palette, which is the document assets right here. You have your layers palette, which is right here. And then you have your plugins, which I don't have any installed at the moment, but you can add various functionality to XD through the plugin library. So I'm going to go back to layers because that'll be the one that I'll use a lot at the moment. In the middle here, you have your artboard and your workspace, right? And of course, if I grab the magnifying glass and zoom back, just like in Adobe Illustrator, you can see that you have lots of space to work, right? So that's your artboard in the middle. The light gray color represents your scratch space or active area where you can put assets and graphics and type and bits and pieces of things, or you can make more artboards and put them all over the place. And then the dark gray area is the dead space where you can't really do anything, but lots of space to work. Very similar to the way Illustrator is, right? Okay, and then over here on the right, you have your responsive palette, which I like to refer to as the Golf Caddy palette. Similar to the Properties palette in Adobe Illustrator, it changes and gives you different functionality based on whatever is active in the workspace. Right now, the artboard is active, as you can see by the blue wired bounding box that is around it, right? And so it's giving me adjustments over here in the responsive palette that it thinks I will need to work with this particular artboard. Okay. Now the bounding box, which you're going to see a lot of, is similar to the one that is in Adobe Illustrator. The only real difference is that the anchor points are circles as opposed to squares, but other than that, it's pretty simple. Does the same sort of stuff. Now, the first thing you want to do is you want to get into the habit of naming your artboards. So it just names them in a similar fashion to the way the Layers palette names layers in Photoshop. It just names them, 1, 2, 3. It just numbers them. So here we have Web 1921, which is pretty nondescript, right? So the first one you're designing, you want to name Homepage. A simple double click on the name of the artboard, and you can name it Homepage, and then hit return. You can also rename things over here in the Layers palette by double-clicking on the name there, just like you would in any of the Layers palettes and any of the Adobe products. You can rename things there too. Now, I know the Adobe products are known for having very complex menu systems, toolboxes, redundant tasks, etc., etc. Because Adobe XD is a newer piece of software, it actually has more in common with other more simpler programs like Adobe Spark than it does with, say, Adobe Photoshop, which is very complex. Adobe Illustrator has taken some steps towards simplifying the workflow by introducing the responsive properties palette, but they also didn't subtract a lot of the functionality, so it can be a little confusing. The functionality in XD is just what you need it to be to get the job done. So if you want to pull down some guides, if you hover over the top section of your artboard, you'll see that your arrow turns from a single arrow to a double-sided arrow, which allows you to click and drag down some guides. And notice that as I'm dragging out a guide that the smart guides turn on. You remember smart guides? They exist in Photoshop and Illustrator. These are sort of purple and green and dotted lines that basically give you immediate feedback information in terms of where things are. So you can see that the purple line along the side here is telling me how far from the top on the y-axis, remember y-axis is vertical, up and down, that I am. And then at the bottom is the remainder of the size of the whole document. And then of course you can see the guide and it's showing me where I am, etc., etc. And then you can drop it off. If I don't want the guide, I can just simply drag it off screen. If you would like a vertical guide, you hover over the left side of the artboard and do the same thing. So pretty straightforward, which is great. Another thing is if you want the artboard itself to be active, simply click on it. But right now it's an empty artboard. There's no assets on here. So once you get some graphics and stuff on here, you're better off just clicking the name of the artboard and that will activate it as well. And it's an easier click. It's a cleaner click. Notice over here in the responsive palette that again, like I said, it gives you some adjustments that are pertinent to what you're doing. You can change the orientation of the artboard from horizontal to vertical. You can change the size by simply clicking in different numerical values. You can lock the ratio by turning on the lock. So if I do change one of the sizes, it'll change the other one accordingly, and so on and so forth. You can adjust how it scrolls. So it's set by default at vertical scrolling, but you can also have no scroll. You can shut off the scrolling if you would like. Now, I usually just leave this alone because the only time scrolling really engages is if you lengthen the size of the artboard by grabbing the anchor point at the bottom and clicking and dragging it downwards. Now in doing that, you'll see that this dotted line has appeared. And what that is showing me is the bottom of the original measurement of the page, right? And anything above that is considered above the fold, meaning that's what would be visible when you land on the home page in any web browser. And anything below that would be scrollable space, right? So you want to essentially leave it as is if you want a page-to-page website, or if you want a scrolling website, you click and drag downwards, and then that creates the scrolling space for as long as you would like that to be. But as long as you are up against the dotted line, then it's a single page site. All of the interactions in XD are magnetic, meaning that if I get close to something, it snaps into place like that, so that you know that you're exactly in the right spot. So take advantage of that. It's part of the Smart Guide situation. Also, over here on the right, I could add some color to the artboard if I knew I wanted a background color for my website. If I didn't want it to be white, I can simply go to Appearance, go to Fill, and then fill that in. Notice that the appearance adjusters in XD have multiple steps. First, you have to check it to turn it on. So like there is a fill, right? So if I uncheck it, there's no fill. It doesn't exist. But if I check it, then it has a fill color. Then you go to the color box, and that opens up the color picker. You'll notice that this color picker is decidedly less complicated than the color picker in Photoshop and Illustrator, which has a variety of inputs. Here, we simply have the color wheel as represented by this vertical color wheel here, right? Just like the one you would see in Illustrator. Allows you to go from red all the way back to red through all the colors in the color wheel. It has the light and dark Munsell color model over here, where I can add light or I can add darkness to a given color just by dragging it around. It has a hexadecimal code input bar, so if I had a specific hexadecimal code that I wanted, 336699, I could just do that, one of my favorite hexadecimal code colors. Or if I wanted to put in a measurement other than hexadecimal code, if I wanted to put in an RGB formula, I can switch the unit of measure to RGB and put those numerical values in, or HSB, and I can go with that. The other thing you can do, of course, is go to this here, which will allow you to adjust sort of the saturation level of the color, right? Or the transparency of the color, I should say. And so you can put that in by either putting in a numerical value or by using the slider on the far right, which will add more transparency as you go down until it becomes entirely invisible. So two ways to put that in. But I'm just going to go back and make my artboard white. Most of the time that'll probably be the case, but of course you can do different things. Now next you can turn on a grid if you would like. Again, check it off. And you have two options for grids. You can go with a layout grid, which is a column grid. So you could determine the number of columns you're going to use. So if you designed your wireframe using a column grid, you can replicate that here by choosing the number of columns. So let's say you went with a 4-column grid design. You can change that. You can change the width of the gutter. And I probably shouldn't have to say this, but because we're in web design, obviously every unit of measure here is pixels. Pixels and points, that's all we care about in web design. No inches, no millimeters. We do pixels and points, but mostly pixels. So we could change the gutter width so that the space between each column is wider or more narrow, like that. Put in 40 pixels in between. You can adjust the column width itself so that they're not equidistant, and then there's some other adjustments at the bottom here. And if you don't want to do a column grid, or a layout grid as they call it, you could do a typical grid, a square grid, also referred to as an art grid. And so you can adjust that as well, talk about how wide each separation is. So like I usually like to set it at say 50 pixels so that I can do everything in measurements of 50, 100, 150, 200, so on and so forth. But another way to do it is to make everything in units of 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. So that also helps as well. So up to you, however you want to do it, whether you're using a grid or not, simply turn it on or off. So those are the major functionality adjustments here for the artboard. Okay, now once we get that going, of course, make sure you save as you go here. We want to essentially go over to our wireframe and replicate that. Now, if your wireframe is done on paper, you're going to have to take some measurements and try to replicate it using simple shapes, rectangles, squares, etc., or dragging out guides in XD to replicate that. However, if you went ahead and made your wireframe like I did here in Adobe Illustrator, then this is where we can really introduce the idea that Adobe XD At its heart, while it is a web prototyping tool, it is really a layout tool. And as such, and similar to other layout tools like Adobe InDesign, it really manages to handle a variety of different file types really well. It handles vector graphics, it handles pixel graphics, it handles typography, and it actually does a much better job than even Adobe InDesign of copy, paste, drag and drop, and maintaining the attributes of everything that you either drag onto it or copy paste into it. What do I mean? Let's demonstrate. So we'll go over to Illustrator. Here is my wireframe, right? And of course my wireframe is made up of a series of rectangles or rounded rectangles in different shades of gray. I have my guides in place. Now if I simply lasso my entire collection of wireframe objects here, select all of them and copy them, and then go over to XD, because my artboard is the exact same size in Illustrator and over here in XD, and then hit paste, it is going to drop in my wireframe pieces perfectly nicely, and I can just center them on the artboard. They are already scaled properly so that they fit within the margin that I determined in my wireframes. So you can see if I go back and forth between Illustrator and XD, looks the same. Now the nice thing is this is not just a flat image that I can design on top of it. You'll see over here in my layers palette, it came in as a group. So it groups them together, puts them in a folder, and then if I click on the folder, it shows me the group. But of course, if I want to, I can ungroup them. All I have to do is right-click on the group and go to Ungroup, and it ungroups them, and now I have all these individual items. So now if I click on it, even though they're all inside the folder, and then I click a couple of times, I can get the header bar, which is known as path 1, this content cube here, this content cube here, so on and so forth. And if you really want to be super organized and persnickety in your web design, and I totally recommend doing that, organization is tantamount in web design, you can click on each of these and rename them over here. Remember, a lot of times in XD, when you're creating prototypes, you will be sharing this file with your web developer, who will be doing all the complex coding for the website. And so the more organized you are, the easier it is for them to work with your prototype. Even if you're sharing it with other team members for other reasons, it's much more useful to name things and organize things than it is to just let people guess at it. So I can simply name this header, right, because that is the header bar that I created. And this guy down here is the footer, so we'll call that footer. And of course, every time I click on one, it lights up in the layers palette, so it's easy to find, right? And then this here is the big gray rectangle in the back for the main navigation. So I'm just going to call this one nav, and we'll call it nav 1, right? Just for some level of organization. And then I have this rectangle here, so we'll call that nav 2. And then this guy here we'll call nav 3. You know, you're just adding some organization to your stuff. Then this here is a content box, or at least that's what I have in mind for it. That's what I'm thinking. So we'll call that content 1. And then this one here, content 2. And lastly, content 3. And just in a couple of seconds here, you've got it all nice and organized, right? Now, it goes beyond just replicating your wireframe. We're going to be able to use these shapes as actual containers to hold things. So let's talk about that and how we're going to do this. So we'll keep this live and active, and we'll get going from here. Now, I am going to take a look at my folder of images, which I have here. Remember, these are the optimized ones. These are the ones that are ready to rock and roll for web consumption. And I'm specifically going to grab my header image here. Now, similar to InDesign, the content shapes that you create in XD will hold images inside them, right? They won't sit on top. They'll go inside like mats, like masks almost. So all you've got to do is right from your folder. Now, these images have already been optimized. I know they look good. I don't have to do any adjustments to them. I'm going to pick up my header image, and because I already selected the header rectangle at the top here, right? It's active. You can see the bounding box. I'm going to pick up the image from my file collection and drop it in, and watch what happens when I go over it. Boop, turns blue, right? It's just waiting to receive that photo. So when I let it go, it drops the photo inside the rectangle. Now the photo is sized perfectly, so when I double click on it, you don't see any extra photo. But if the photo was bigger, you would see the rest of the photo extending north and south of it, or to the right or the left. So I can make some adjustments. Now the other thing I can do is, again, click on that, and if I want to resize the box that it lives in, I can just simply grab the anchor point and shrink it down. And so notice that as I'm shrinking it, I'm getting those smart guides popping up that shows me that I'm lining up with things nice and neat. So make sure your stuff's organized. So I'm going to drag it over to here because I'm going to leave this white space over here for the logo. Now the next thing I want to do is, even though I originally thought I was going to need all of these rectangles for navigation, I would really rather use this space for my logo, and I really don't need all this navigation. So I'm going to double click on this rectangle and shrink it down, so I can leave a nice big square space up here for my logo. Now let's go over to the logo. And again, I have that in Illustrator living in my style guide here. So there's my logo, and click it. It's already grouped together. All these items are grouped. So I could drag it over to XD, but I'm just going to copy it. I'm just going to do Command-C, copy it, go back over to XD, and make sure that you have nothing active, right? So click in the gray space so nothing is active, because we don't want to drop the logo into something. I just want to drop it on top of things. So then I'll paste it, and then there's my logo. Now what's excellent about this is not only does it drop my logo in a beautiful vector format, but if I double click on the logo, it opens it up as a group. See that over here? And then if I keep clicking it, you can see that I can drill down to the individual objects. So if I just want to work on the inside of the donut, I can literally change the color over here if I wanted to and make it a completely different color. Now I don't want to do that, but you get the idea. So not only does it copy and paste it, but it maintains all of its editability from Illustrator, even down to the font. So I choose this one here, and it actually shows me the font right here. So not only can I change the font, but I can even change what it says. I can go in and change it from Dave's to, Dawn's, and go from there. Maybe Dawn bought Dave out and she took over the donut business. I don't know. So you get the idea. So not only does it really handle great file type conversion from drag and drop and copy paste, but it keeps them completely editable. And again, once you drop stuff in, make sure you're naming things, right? So this is my logo. It named it Group 7, which is not super useful. So we'll call this logo. And of course, we can fold up the logo like that. So now I can have easy access to it. So anyway, now I can line it up. And again, smart guides are helping me out here. And I can put it where I want it, right? Can resize it so that it lines up nicely here. And maybe I want to leave it like that. So we'll tap it over a little bit so that it's kind of centered. Make sure it lines up at the top, and boom, I got my logo in. Pretty great, right? Now, from there, I'm going to do some other stuff. Now, I want to use the same font right here from Dave's on the navigation. Now, I know over here, back in my style guide, I said that I was going to use alternate Gothic for headlines and then Avenir for the other type. But I do want to use this font that I used for the name Dave's, right? Which is a different font entirely. I want to use that in limited use. I don't want to put it over here in the main content area. For there, I'm going to use Avenir and my other fonts. But I want to do it here. Now, the easiest way to do this, right, I don't have to I could make a new text box, right? I could grab text and make a new text box and start from scratch, or I could simply duplicate Dave's and bring it down into these other navigation areas. And remember, this is grouped together. So I can just click on this a few times until I get down to the text box that contains Dave, and then I can copy it and click over here in the gray space, so I'm disconnecting everything, and then paste it, and then boom, there it is. So I now have a duplicate, so I'm going to drag that down, and now from here I can use the option drag feature to make duplicates, and I'm just going to put Dave's all the way down, right? And we'll do that, and then I'm going to change what each one says. Actually, the first thing I should do is make sure they're all center justified, so that as I'm changing the names, they're not running off to one side, they work in the middle. So I'm going to select all of those text boxes just by shift clicking them. Go over here to the palette, center justify everything. So now when I change what it says, we can type in specials. Yes, I know it's too big. We'll fix that in a minute. And we have different types of donuts. We have cake donuts, and we have frosted donuts, and we have filled donuts. I apologize if everybody's getting hungry. So now we want to change the font size of these so that they fit neatly inside here, but you don't want them to be different font sizes, right? You want them to be the same size throughout. Good rule of thumb is you take your longest word, which in this case is specials, and you decide on the font size for that, and then you apply that to everything else. So right now it's a little more than 93, so let's go down to 80 and see if that fits. Still a little big, so we'll go down to 75. Yeah, that fits nicely. So now I can shift click all of these, and I know that 75 will work nicely. Make it 75. They all fit. Now, I don't want to leave them this blue-green color. I'm going to make them white. So shift-click all of them. Go over here to the palette and go to Fill, bring it up to white, and now we're ready to go. Excellent. So now I want to start assigning some colors to things. Now, I did have this color palette back over here, right? So since we know that we can copy and paste things, what if I just grab my whole color palette, right? I'm going to just lasso my color palette, copy it, bring that over to XD, and I'm going to kind of slide to the left a little bit here and drop it off and then put it over here on the left so that I'll have access to it, right? And again, it groups it together, and it's in the paste board, you'll see, because here we're on the home page, and then here it's on the paste board. So your layers are specific to their location, okay? So this scratch space is referred to as the paste board, and so I'm gonna just name that color palette, so I'll have it for later. Now, why am I dragging my color palette over here? Well, because I wanna use the eyedropper tool to be able to just sample my colors from here as I'm going. Now, I could have written down what the RGB formulas were for each of these and then plug that in over here in the main palette, but it's much easier to use the eyedropper tool, right? So, for example, I want to select these dark gray rectangles, and I'm going to go over here to Fill, grab the eyedropper tool, and I'm going to sample this color here. Boom, very nice. And then I'm going to grab the lighter gray rectangle in the back, grab the eyedropper tool, and we'll go with the lighter purple color. Boom. Very nice. All right, so now we're getting some synergy in terms of color here. Now, there are some special effects you can add in XD. There's not a boatload of them. It's not like Illustrator that has a ton of effects. But there's some very useful ones that sort of help add a little three-dimensionality and make things interesting. So I'm going to choose each of my type boxes here for my main navigation. And I'm going to go over here, and under Fill, then there's Border, then we have Shadow. So I'm going to put a shadow on underneath each of these. And then there's some adjustments you can make with shadow, right? If you click on it, you can choose how opaque the shadow is. So I'm going to make it a little darker so we can absolutely see it. And you can even change the color of the shadow. This is just a black shadow. I don't really want to use any black in here, so instead I'm going to grab this eyedropper tool and pick up that dark blue color, which is useless in front of this blue, but then I can go back over to the color picker and darken it up so that it works for all of them, but it's not black, right? It's just sort of a dark version of that blue. You can also adjust the depth of the shadow, its location based on the X and Y axis, so you can make all those adjustments there, but I'm pretty happy with it like that. So that looks good. Then again, click in the scratch space so everything's sort of deactivated. Kind of the same rule of thumb you would do in Illustrator, right? When you're done working with something, you do that. Okay, next I'm going to drop some photos and some text in here. So I'm going to grab this content container here that again came right from my wireframes. And I'm going to go back to my collection of photos, and we're going to pick up this photo of this woman here. Let's say she's the manager of Dave's, and we'll put her in. And again, drag the photo right from your collection into the container. And there she is. And again, if I double click on it, see how the remainder of the photograph is visible on the left and right. So if I wanted to kind of recenter her, I could until I was happy with it, and then just click. Then you're in good shape. Now, any content container that contains a photo, I want it to have a shadow, so it looks a little three-dimensional. So I'm going to choose that container again, go over here to the adjustment palette, turn on the shadow, And same thing, I'm going to increase the opacity of it a little bit so it's a little more visible. And this one I'm going to leave black so that it's a bit of a gray because it makes more sense against a white background. Okay, next, going to drop another photo into this content container here. And we'll grab one of our donut collections. Maybe we'll get this guy. Move this over a little so I can see better. Drop him in. Come on. Oh, I got the spinning beach ball of death. Give me a second. All right, there we go. All right, so that's in. And again, I can double click it and kind of adjust what I'm showing inside the frame. That looks pretty good. Click that. Now I'm going to add some text, right? So this content container here is meant to hold text, but I don't really want to, keep the gray. But I'm going to leave it there for now because it gives me a place to start from. So I am going to grab my text tool over here. And just like at Illustrator, you can either click once and start typing, or you can click and drag out a text box. So I'm going to click and drag out a text box. And I'm going to make it the same size as this gray rectangle. And go back to the selection arrow here. Oop. Go back to the, hold on, let me grab my text tool again, do this. Okay, so I'm going to put some text in it just temporarily so that it lives for a second. And go ahead and drag out the text box so that it's about the same size as the gray content container. I can change it later, of course, but I wanted to eat up about the same space. Now, I put in just a couple of letters so that I could see how big it is. It's too big, right? What it does is XD remembers your last typographic adjustments and then applies them to your next typographic item. So I need to change this. So remember over here in our style guide, I decided for body copy to go with Avenir Book. So we're going to change that to Avenir Book. Go with that. And you can just start typing if you want, and it will find it for you, or you can go to the pull down menu. So there's Avenir and it's black, so I want to change it to Book. And 75 points is way too big, so we're going to make it like 22 points, which is much better for a paragraph on a website. Okay, we'll deal with the color of the font. Next, we'll go from white to something else. So let's grab our eyedropper tool, and I'm going to grab my dark color from my color palette, because that's a good font color for body copy. And we're going to left justify it. Okay, so now that we're ready to rock and roll here, now we can put in the type. Now I could hand type in something, but I have my lorem ipsum over here, so I'm going to go ahead and just grab some lorem ipsum, which is just going to be a placeholder, and we'll copy that and go over here to XD and paste it. And that goes in, and I do have to make some adjustments to it because the leading wasn't adjusted, so we'll do that. Go over here, put in 0. Okay, so now that's better. So that sets it to the default leading. So that looks pretty good, right? And then I'm going to put in a header. So I'm going to go down one line and put in about our donuts. Okay, and since that's a header, I'm going to use what I said I would do over here in Illustrator. I'm going to go with alternate Gothic. So with that highlighted, go over here and start typing in alternate Gothic. There it is. And increase the size of it a little bit so it's much bigger. Okay, maybe a little bigger than that. Okay, that looks wonderful. And I'm going to change the color of that from that dark color to, I'm going to grab this blue-green color. Okay. And you can continue to adjust the type so that it's exactly the way you want it until you're happy with it. Now I can get rid of this gray content box behind it because I've already used it to frame up where I'm going. So I don't need it anymore. That can go away. And now I've got my text box, which I can adjust. I can go ahead and lower the height a little bit so that it fits better into the space. And that looks pretty nice. All right, great. We're good to go. Now, of course, if this was actual copy, you would want to go in and play around with the rag edge, make sure it's nice and neat. Well, that doesn't really work. So that's good, and sort of keep going from there. But since this is just dummy copy, we'll leave it alone as is. Okay, next, we're going to put some text up here in the top, right? So I'm going to grab the type tool, and again, we're going to actually start with the Dave type again, right? So we'll grab maybe a type box from our navigation, and we're going to duplicate that, just put it up here, and we can go ahead and change what it says. So this is going to be sort of like their call to action thing. Best donuts ever, right? And we can put that in the middle, and then the bounding box for type allows you to resize it by simply dragging out the bottom. So we'll do that and pick it up and put it sort of roughly in the center. Use your smart guides. Okay, now I'm going to get rid of the shadow. I don't want that, so I'm going to uncheck it. But I also don't want it to be white type on a background. So you'll notice over here under Appearance, not only can I change the fill, the border, or the shadow, but I can also add some blending modes. You remember these. They live in the Layers palette in both Illustrator and Photoshop. So same blending modes you're already used to. So I'm going to go with Overlay. I love Overlay. It sort of does a nice job of embedding it into the background. But then I'm going to add a border or a stroke to it. It's funny, in Illustrator they refer to the outline as a stroke, and in XD they refer to it as a border. I do kind of wish they were consistent with their terminology, but they're not. So I'm going to make the border white, and I'm going to increase the size of the border to 2 pixels, and then that makes it stand out a little bit more. Okay, next, the footer. So we're going to grab that container, and again, change the fill. This time we're going to go with that green color, and add a little shadow to that too. And I'm going to grab my picture container. I forgot to add the shadow to that. So we'll do that. And then lastly, we're just going to put some text into the bottom here. So again, grab some text, and we can put in whatever we want. Remember, start out with just some dummy text, and then you can go over here and change it. So we want Avenir again, and we're going to go with Avenir book, and we're going to change the size a lot to like 14, maybe even less, maybe a little more, maybe like 20. Okay, Avenir book, right? And make sure it's left justified, and it's already white, and we're going to get rid of the border. We don't need that. Okay, now we can go back and type what we want to say, right? So we got Dave's Delectable Donuts, 1445 Main Street, Somerville, Mass. I don't know the zip code in Somerville. I'm going to make it up, 02145 123 and then phone number. Right, so footer information. So you can put that in there, make sure it's nice and centered, line it up where you want it. Okay, so now some cleanup, right? So you want to group some stuff together that needs to be grouped together. So for example, our footer bar and our text should be grouped together. So we'll do that. So that's grouped. So now when we check it, you'll see it says group 7. We can call that footer. Got it. And then you want to go through your layers and make sure everything's named, right? So everything has a real name. It doesn't just say, shape or whatever. So if you're not sure what something is, click it. And then some of it you probably want to leave because this entire group is the logo. So that's okay. We can fold that up. That's fine as long as it says logo. And then this larger group here is the layout. So we can keep that, but you can also ungroup it if you want, which allows you to figure out sort of other areas. So get yourself cleaned up, but pretty much everything is named nicely. Okay, so looks pretty good, right? Now, the next thing we're going to do is, so let's say we're happy with this. It's our home page. We've spent a lot of time on it. I realize I just kind of breezed through that quickly, but you're really happy with it. You've spent time with it. You've showed it to a couple people. You get some good feedback. Now we want to work on the other pages for our website. So the easiest way to do that is similar to what we do in Adobe InDesign with creating master pages. We're going to use this as our starting point, and if you click the name of your artboard and then do Option Drag, you can duplicate it, and then this can be the next page. This could be the specials page, and you can continue to do this, right? Click, Option Drag, right? And then this could be the cake pages, and so on and so forth. And now I can go back and change the details that will be attributable to each of those pages. Okay, so that is essentially the design phase of Adobe XD. Obviously, your site's going to be very different than mine. This is just a demonstration. But just to show you how versatile Adobe XD is, how well it works with other programs like Adobe Illustrator, and how easy it is to drag and drop files that you've already optimized right into it. Pretty simple, great stuff. Feel free to leave things into the pasteboard or the scratch space. Like I like leaving the color palette out there because I'll use it as I go along. It's easy for eyedroppering things. So now you're going to go ahead and design your pages for your redesigned website. So that's going to take a long time, so get on it. Make sure you give yourself a lot of time to work on it. And then next week, once we have our finished design, we're going to start prototyping. But don't worry about that right now. Go design. All right, you guys have a great day. I will see you soon.